Welcome back, everyone, to the People's Academy. We are now in the penultimate unit of Chapter 2 on imperialism as the primary contradiction. Today, we'll look at a topic that I think holds special relevance in the present moment and which deserves particular care. And that's the topic of fascism. Now, everyone loves throwing around accusations of fascism, in particular, the imperialists themselves. There's an excellent essay by Louis Alday and Ebb magazine, which I'll share later in the description of this lecture. The essay is called Worse Than Hitler. And it charts how throughout the Cold War and into the present day, the imperialist countries sought to discredit revolutionary and anti-hegemonic forces by comparing their leaders to Hitler. So Fidel Castro was compared to Hitler, as was Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi and Slobodan Milosevic and Bashar al-Assad and Kim Jong-un. Even Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser was given the title Hitler on the Nile, and many others have faced similar slander. And of course, if we look to the present day, even as they commit our generation's Holocaust, we hear from Zionist leaders about how Hamas is worse than the Nazis. And if you trace this record of propaganda, it seems that for at least the countries of the West, everyone is Hitler except Hitler himself. That is to say, fascism is everywhere except in the world that gave rise to Hitler, except in the world that carried forward the imperialist and colonial traditions into the present day, into a new century. And my sense is that these arguments work, that they take hold because the liberal understanding of fascism that many of us are brought up with is constrained by these simplistic narratives and categories of authoritarianism or dictatorship, or by their focus on purely aesthetic or rhetorical traits. You know, appeals to nationhood, mass marches, political discipline, mass politics generally. These are often in liberal narratives portrayed as fascistic. And so you have, liberal intellectuals like Timothy Snyder who will tell you these are the 10 symptoms of fascism. If you see 6 out of these 10 things, it means you're looking at a fascist project. And I think this ignores, and not only ignores, but deliberately conceals the structural roots of fascism. It conceals the emergence of fascism as a political response, a particular kind of political response to crises within capitalism, and in particular within capitalism in the imperialist heartlands and in the former colonial metropoles. So what is fascism? How do we understand it? And how, as movements and peoples, do we confront it? And here to help us unpack these questions, we have Dr. Matteo Capasso. Dr. Capasso is a professor at the School of Country and Region Studies at the Institute of Middle East Studies at Northwest University in the city of Xi'an in the People's Republic of China. He is also editor-in-chief of Middle East Critique and the author of the book Everyday Politics in the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. Matteo, thank you so much for being with us, especially at this very late hour in China. And over to you.
Thank you, Powell. Thank you, comrades. Thank you all. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone who's joining us live, and to those, of course, that will be listening to our thoughts on fascism and this very important topic we're going to be discussing today. So thank you for having come here and join us all to think through this one of the historical and political movements that I guess we can definitely say really captures the essence of our contemporary historical moment in many ways. I would like to start probably thinking about how this was an article that I read on the media some time ago, which of course it means that the number has gone up. I would like to start by thinking that when Zionist forces unleashed, what the Zionist forces unleashed upon Gaza is the equivalent amount of explosives and bombs that the Allied forces dropped on Nazi Germany. Yet this time in service of genocide, ethnic cleansing, rather than liberation from fascism. So when this is happening, it means that the wheels of history are moving in the opposite direction of liberation, stability, and a shared future for humankind. So this image should not disturb us only because of its immediate moral horror, but because it reveals something fundamental about the world system that we inhabit, and something that most of our education, academic education, school education, and of course, inevitably political education, especially the one that consolidated since the 1980s, has trained us not to see. Again, as the title of the lecture suggests today, Global Fascism, we will explore that basically fascism is not simply something that deviates from the normal functioning of capital, not an aberration, not something like monstrous, but rather fascism is the most natural and sophisticated political response that, as Powell also was saying, that when capital's domination faces a serious challenge, or we could also say when capital enters a phase of crisis, which periodically does, as we all know, then fascism comes in. We will see, so what I want to discuss is that what we call global fascism represents the systematic deployment of genocidal and terrorist methods that have always been central to capital accumulation, to imperialist capital accumulation. And in this current historical juncture, fascism and these methods have intensified, this praxis have intensified and globalized due to a whole variety of factors, which we will discuss, and I am sure you have discussed already in other lectures with Paris Sierros, for example, that have challenged the Western US-led unipolar moment. So I like to structure this lecture into four main parts. The first part, we will establish a core tenet of our lecture, which is fascism is intrinsic to the nature of capital. So to do so, we must discuss the notion of imperialism as a process, not simply as a process of economic domination, but fundamentally genocidal, about plundering, so where destruction becomes production. So we must maintain what I call the primacy of politics. In other words, we must firmly remain Marxist, but also Leninist in our analysis, because politics maintains its primary role. In the second part, we will analyze how fascism has historically emerged as imperialism political response to liberation movements that threatened its reproduction. And so this is where it is fundamental for us to understand why fascism and liberal democracy function as complementary rather than opposing systems. We will discuss this in the first part as well, but in both parts, it's fundamental to understand that liberalism and socialism and social democrats are fundamentally connected to fascism. We will see how. The third part, instead, we will try to basically, after we historicize this, we will bring it to the present moment, exploring why fascism is resurging globally as a range of challenges, African and West Asian anti-colonial movements, Russia's war against NATO, the economic and the ironclad protection of sovereignty of China, and new social-political formation expanding, BRICS, and so on. Western dominance is threatened in ways that cannot be contained through normal channels. Hence, fascism is required. It's the answer. In the fourth part, I am going to zoom into the utmost incarnation of fascism today, what I call fascism with Jewish characteristics, or also known as Zionism. And this is where I believe that we have to look at Zionism from an international perspective at this moment in history as the central front of a battle against global fascism today. So, in this first part, we need to confront a fundamental problem in how Western intellectuals, Western political thought, the wealth of ideas that the Western world has created, taught us to think about fascism itself. And, this is precisely what Pavel began with. This wealth of ideas, which accompanies the material production of capital, basically justifies it, reduces fascism to specific European movements of the 1930s and 40s. Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, Franco's Spain. Then, of course, there is the application of the same categories to anything that comes from the south of the world. I am going to skip that part. Why? Because I think it's much more, clear why it's done, and we will talk about it, of course. I will stop on the European periodization here. Fascism came, it was just, it was Mussolini, it was Hitler, it was Franco. Well, this obsessive focus on these moments emerges, because this is when fascism came home to Europe, when the techniques of colonial first, imperial later domination were finally deployed against basically white European population. So this is where we encounter the famous crucial insight from Aimé Césaire in his discourse on colonialism. And this is where Césaire tells us that a society that colonizes inevitably becomes morally diseased and calls for its own Hitlers. So the techniques of genocidal and racial violence, dehumanization, bureaucratized and systematized mass killing that Europe developed in its colonies provided both the ideological framework and the material praxis that would later be deployed against European population under these fascist regimes. This is the boomerang effect. Colonial violence comes back home into the metropole. Now, our educational system separates fascism as a horror, because again, that's another issue. The issue is that fascism is presented morally as something barbaric, never again, as a horror. Fascism is separated from colonialism and imperialism. The latter, instead, is almost presented as an inevitable process of history and progress. We needed to go there. We needed to kill these people. We just didn't limit this process when he came back home. And so why am I talking about this limitation? Because this is when we're faced with the knowledge production out there, the wealth of ideas. Fascism then is limited to these historical episodes, and there is a systematic refusal to recognize the wealth of history, not just of ideas, which is to recognize the centuries of colonial genocide, slavery, basically the fact the European civilizational history, the very foundation of Western wealth and power, has been fundamentally fascist in character. This is fact, but this myopia serves as a clear ideological function. It allows Western liberal socio-political formation to present themselves as the antithesis of fascism, as the defenders of democracy. But simultaneously, and I'm going to go back to this, they both maintain the structures of bourgeois control that make their privilege possible. We're going to go through Dimitrov analysis, also the Bulgarian communists, to explain this, the theory of the two lesser evils. But if we are serious about understanding global fascism, if we want to really look at the war, then we must reject this sanitized version and examine fascism in relation to imperialism. And again, imperialism then must be looked at, and here I'm going to draw on your previous lectures, so to make it easier to everyone, and also to encourage everyone to watch what has been talked about in the previous one. I'm going to use the definition of Ali al-Qadri when he talks about accumulation by waste. In other words, systematic destruction serves and killing and clobbering serves as the primary engine of capital accumulation. Let's explain this in concrete terms, because I'm sure Ali has done already a great job to describe it in thought, in a theoretical form. So from a Western-centric understanding of capital accumulation, what is often also referred as Western Marxism, we are taught that in traditional capitalist production, we have workers that transforms raw materials into commodities that contain more value than inputs. So that's where the exploitation process takes place. So we are used to thinking of capital accumulation as a process limited to the sphere of factories, if we want, where the class struggle entails the main contradiction between capital and labor. Now, if we shift this main contradiction that Western Marxism presents itself to a world scale, and this is where many third world teachers and educators insisted to do what they insisted to do, then a system of capital accumulation on a world scale appears in front of our eyes. And that's imperialism. In such system, we see that human lives do not simply transform raw materials, but they themselves function as raw materials. So when the Western ruling classes wage wars against the people of the South, the latter become the dead bodies that serve as outputs in the process of capital accumulation. So the instruments used to annihilate and kill people operate as both means and ends of accumulation. Now, the value that is created through these wars, through these killings, it's not just the manufacturing of weapons. We tend to think of the military-industrial complex. They are killing. Oh, look who's benefiting the most. I don't know, Raytheon or Lockheed Martin, and so on and so forth. Of course, this is a part of the story, but this is a very economistic outlook if we look at it. What we need to think, and I go back to the Leninist primacy of politics, the entire relation between subjects and objects here, so the bodies are both in this case, in the production process, becomes inverted. So we have basically not a double consumption, because the traditional labor exploitation is combined with the literal consumption of the laborers themselves. Of course, these are the labors of the south of the world. So killing, it's literally foundational to imperialism. Now, you zoom into Gaza, and this is where you understand exactly how this is happening. Well, we can think of many other examples, but let's go into Gaza since October 2023. People talk about 40 million tons of debris containing human remains, hazardous material, destroying water treatment facilities, agricultural land, hospitals, schools. Everything is being destroyed. Is this just a question of military-industrial complex? The destruction serves a political function. It eliminates the material and social conditions required for Palestinian resistance to reproduce itself as an organized force. You're killing life. And politically, you are killing the conditions, the mode of social reproduction required for resistance to reproduce itself against capital. This is fascism. It is fascism. You're killing, you're just brutally killing everybody. And at this point, and this is why Syria collapses at the same time. You destroy Syria for the same reason. Why would Syria undergo 15 years of a foreign-led wars? Because you needed to destroy, to eliminate the social and political mode of reproduction that has enabled Syrian to gain independence and to maintain, with its own limitation, a strong resistance against imperial control. But I'm talking about 2024 and 2023. To understand this inherent relationship, you just need to go back to the genocide of the indigenous people in the Americas. So this is something that has always struck with me. And the book is by Stannard, I think it was written in 1992, where he writes that historical demographers estimate that after Christopher Columbus depopulation, arrival, whatever, 1492, the population rates were between 90 and 98%, with an overall decline of 95% serving as a working rule of thumb. This means that for every 20 indigenous people alive at the moment of European contact, only one remained when the bloodbath concluded. I stop here because this is fascism. This is the history that we carry. And I meant when we carry, I mean the West. This is the history of the West. This is the history of capital. This is why fascism, when we think of it as a method of violence and terrorism and genocide, it's at the core of Western historical process of capital accumulation. You kill what? The social systems, the knowledge practices, the territorial relationships that were created by the indigenous, and you replace them with settler colonialism. Now, the other fundamental point to keep in mind here, and this is where we have to establish the two main points today, which is fascism and the relationship of fascism with liberalism. The other fundamental point is that the liberal ideas, or liberalism itself, which I'm going to define it soon, is born out of the very fascist practice of colonial domination and slavery. Now, I recommend always reading the work of a paisano, you would say, Domenico Losurdo, Liberalism and Counter History. It's very, Losurdo had, how do you say, it was probably something that many of his contemporary thinkers didn't like, but it was the strongest capacity, which is, he was a philosopher, but he was a philosopher of history. There are no ideas without history, and there is no history without ideas. But he wouldn't abstract something. He would always make sure to look at the praxis that accompany the formulation of ideas. And so what does Losurdo what does Losurdo, proceed to do in his work? He looks at the great liberal philosophers who proclaimed freedom and equality, which in any kind of university of the West, in any school, you will be in any American movies or whatever, they're gonna keep coming back. John Locke, Jefferson, Tocqueville, Stuart Mill, and so on. So what it does, it looks how, for example, John Locke, the father of liberalism, was directly involved in the slave trade. And in his second treaty says that there are, and I quote here directly from the book of Losurdo, that by the law of nature, subjected to there are men by the law of nature subjected to the absolute dominion and arbitrary power of their masters. Let's move to John Stuart Mill, author of On Liberty. It says that, unquote, despotism is a legitimate form of government when dealing with barbarians, with a race to be considered minors who owe absolute obedience to their masters. De Tocqueville, Alexis, praised democracy in America, while completely ignoring that this democratic president of its time, Andrew Jackson, was a slave owner, presiding over the systematic extermination of Cherokee people. What I did today, or up to now, I didn't provide you necessarily a definition of fascism. I have historicized the idea of fascism, and that's what needs to be done. That's how it's useful, because we can trace it. So at this point, what Losurdo does is that he tells us that this has created basically an Ehrenvolk democracy, he calls it, a democracy for the master race. That's where the definition of liberalism that today we think of is used. Basically, what happened is that back during the so-called American Revolution, whatever that is, the system operates through a fundamental division. There is a limitation of power and rule of law within the community of free white citizens. So they try to share power, they try to have some sort of democratic understanding of their life and organization of their lives and so on and so forth. But at the same time, this so-called system of democracy and limitation of power and rule of law with its own internal limits is combined with the absolute domination and unlimited violence against whom? You know the answer. So the same US Constitution that proclaims liberty and justice established the explicit legal distinction between free persons, whites, and black slaves. Of course, things change with history, but the system remains the same. This is why you see exactly why liberalism functions in relation to identity politics, because the idea is always to absorb part of that identity, introduce it into this system of limits and limitation of power and rule of law, thus creating this facade of legal protections within the so-called system of ballot box democracy. But what does it say in terms of the material conditions and the mode of social reproduction that continues to rely upon? That doesn't change. Does it stop imperialism? Does it continue to go to war in Iraq? Does it continue to invade Afghanistan? Does it continue to kill and clobber and genocide? Of course it does. Not at the same pace all the time, but this is where we have the changes between the alternation between liberalism and fascism. Now, there is another point that I want you to make about liberalism, and then we pass to part two. And this is, and again, Losurdo is very useful to understand this passage, which is the idea that freedom and emancipation emerge spontaneously from within liberal society through some internal moral progress. So you see, what did I tell you? I told you that there was the idea of free whites and the black race that needed to be enslaved. At some point, the free whites, you know what do? They come up and they're like, we need to give some rights, some freedoms to the poor black slaves. We need to help them. What Losurdo tells us is that for every significant expansion of rights that came through, what was fundamental for that to happen were revolutionary movements that liberalism itself violently opposed. The Haitian Revolution, the successful slave revolt that established the first Black Republic, while Jefferson was trying to starve Haiti into submission, the Bolshevik Revolution, which created pressure that finally ended Jim Crow segregation in the United States, and of course, the whole decolonization process that took place across the various continents of the global South, and the communist pressures coming from within Europe, from within the West, and so on. But this was a struggle, and it was a violent struggle. There was no internal moral progress of liberalism. Because every time liberalism, and this is where the reflection of Georgy Dimitrov, the Bulgarian communist, are very useful when he discusses his critique of the social democrats and the theory of the lesser evils. That every time we are presented with fascism, the social democrats will tell the workers not to go for the socialist revolution, but to go for the lesser evil. Vote for us. There is no need to do this. Just, maintain within the rule of law. Don't push it too much. I don't have to go back to Gaza or to Iraq to see Blair that now they are putting on as a potential ruler of the Palestinian transitional whatever. That's where the two forces align. So this is where we have to be really understanding why liberalism and fascism come together, especially under moments of crisis. Why do they do so? Because both of them, they need they need to maintain and sustain a mode of social reproduction, which is a bourgeois mode of social reproduction. It's bourgeois rule. They're not interested in mediating the interest of the people. They are interested in, maybe in the case of liberalism, to provide a facade of legal limitations and to bring in different parts of society to co-opt them within. Again, this is where we go back to identity politics and how functional it is to liberalism, rather than having a socialist revolution to mediate the interests in favor of the people. And so this is very important for us. And from here, I think, once we establish imperialism genocidal foundation, we can now move to the second part, which is fascism as imperialism political response to a crisis. But I don't want to talk about the current crisis immediately. I want to start from the, how do you say, from the Second World War, okay? Because there is an historical pattern to see how fascist movement emerge and gain mass support precisely when imperialist system face challenges that they cannot resolve through normal political channels. So in the aftermath of World War I, we had a combination of anti-colonial revolts, the Bolshevik Revolution, massive working class uprising across Europe, which created what the ruling class perceived as an existential crisis. Now we're talking about either monarchies or parties, which proved very incapable of containing these revolutionary movements. So again, with the moment the ruling parties, can you hear me?
We can.
The ruling parties are acting. I'm sorry, I just need to switch the light.
Don't worry.
Okay. That was scary. So the moment the ruling parties feel the existential crisis because they're not able to contain all these movements pushing against the dam of reactionism and bourgeois control, this is where we have fascism coming in. Now, it's interesting, the analysis of Georgy Dimitrov, because he talks about the period when there is the rise of fascism in Germany and the Nazi consolidation. And in this process, he discusses how social democratic parties consistently chose maintaining capitalism over advancing towards socialism, even when this choice paved the way for fascist takeover. You have the case of the United States. It's clear right now. It's the same that's happening in Europe, but it's been a gradual process that we've seen over and over the years. The idea is, but look, in the 1950s, it was better. Maybe we can go back to that. We can't go back to that because it's history. Capitalism tends to monopolize. Finance capital extracts more and more. So at the end of the day, the mode of social reproduction required to maintain the bourgeois dominance requires more and more violence. At that point, there is a pushback across history, which we're going to talk about. But this is where we see the fascist and the social democratic parties aligning so clearly in front of our eyes. But let's move to World War II. And because I want to discuss, to understand the crisis that we're facing right now, we have to understand how the consolidation of what I call the fascist international. And I'm sorry if I'm using this term, but I think it's very apt to understand the creation and consolidation of this. And I know Pavel has written a beautiful essay about this as well in Monthly Review, which I also, I think you should put it up in the description as well. It's very useful to understand the history. So the Fascist International was a coordinated network of counter-revolutionary forces, which were designed to prevent decolonization and crush communist movements and socialist movements worldwide. So rather than fascism being defeated in 1945, fascism is strategically relocated and institutionalized through different operations that were part, and this is where I say we need to look at the world as a unit, but also at history as a unified process. And we don't just need to chronologically remember events, but we need to be able to understand how the dialectical process that happens throughout history. So these different operations that were adapted according to different, which took place differently according to the regional context, they all served the same fundamental goal: the maintenance of Western imperial domination. Now, I could tell you easily the story of neoliberalism here, but again, I'm going to be Leninist. I'm going to tell you the story of the politics. You can connect that with the economic part. We know the story of the death of neoliberalism, the extraction, and so on and so forth, the IMF, the Washington Consensus. But behind this, the scale and coordination of the network and the operation that took place is fundamental. Why? Let's start with the United States, of course. And the first operation that comes to mind. Then we can provide readings, you can look it up, but you need to understand three major operations at least. Operation Paperclip. The United States government rehabilitated tens of thousands of Nazis and fascists through this operation, integrating them into scientific, intelligence, and military establishment, including NATO and NASA. Operation Gladio. That's the second operation. Operation Gladio was basically the creation of so-called stay-behind armies across all over Europe, which eventually became the bulk of what became NATO. These weren't defensive networks waiting for Soviet invasion. Because that's how they were always presented. So the idea that the British MI6 and what later became the CIA, the OSS, worked together to create the army, stay-behind armies inside different parts of Europe. Of course, the ones that they had the biggest communist parties, Italy being one of them. They created these forces in order to prevent communist parties from waiting for the invasion of the Soviets. No, they actively supported, coordinated, provided money, funded counter-revolutionary forces. Now, when we think of counter-revolution, you have to think not just of Nazis, you have to think of monarchists, you have to think of the Vatican, you have to think of all the kind of forces that can be co-opted inside the orbit of imperialist domination. And the means used to do this were done, of course, with money, but they were done with propaganda and covert operation, like sabotaging election, using fake documents, systematic use of psychological warfare, and of course, terrorist tactics. Italy was one of the most important theater of this, of Operation Gladio. Because through Operation Gladio, in Italy, we lived the so-called strategy of tension, which means what? That basically there were operation and terrorist bombings in some squares in Bologna, like Piazza Fontana, that killed 17 people. Prime Minister Aldo Moro was kidnapped and eventually killed and assassinated. This strategy of tension made sure that the public was not sure what was happening. Now, in some cases, we do have evidence that neo-fascist groups were definitely working with the CIA. In other cases, we know that other leftist groups were co-opted inside, for example, and they were all working. But what they were doing is that the magnet theory. You pull all these different groups together, you fund all of them, and you make them kill each other. You make them, use violence, and you destabilize the country. While at the same time, you're blaming constantly the leftist forces. I mean, we could make a comparison with Syria here, but I have to be careful with the time. But anyway, what you're seeing is, again, creating chaos, in order to destabilize the possibility that communist forces could rise within Europe. The third operation, very important for us to understand historically, Operation Condor. Operation Condor is the one that took place in Latin America, where there was a coordinated effort by right-wing military dictatorship in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, to act and fight perceived leftist threats. Now, you have to imagine that the School of the Americas, set up by the United States and opened in 1946, trained 11 Latin American heads of states, none of whom came to power democratically, and which later was named the School of Assassins. So you're seeing the political part, and this slowly builds up to neoliberalism. The last point, the last region of which I am probably more familiar with is, of course, is the Arab region. In this region as well, there was a strategy. The strategy was, of course, the support of the establishment of the Zionist state, which became a dagger into the region, and the constant use of reactionary monarchies and religious forces to undermine and prevent Arab unity and Arab development. You need to look for the patterns, not for the events. And when you see the patterns, you're seeing that in the aftermath of World War II, where there was a massive Bolshevik revolution before, there was the rise of communism fighting Nazism. There are the forces, the colonial forces fighting, wanting independence, wanting unity, wanting solidarity, and the possibility of a new international order. This is where the counter-revolutionary forces come in. This is where the fascist international acts through different coordinated ways. And according to the different regional contexts as well, which is very important for us to understand. Now, why this is important? Because, of course, basically what we're seeing is that there was a systematic support for fascist movements over history. We have seen the foundational understanding of imperialism as fascist. We're seeing this happening today in the case of Ukraine, for example, or in Syria, or in Libya, or in the case of Palestine with the Zionist forces. Let's move to the present day then. So we are witnessing the fulfillment of three basic conditions, the ones that I mentioned before, which are necessary for fascist movements to move from the margins to the center of political power. There is the existence of a systemic crisis that cannot be resolved through existing institutional mechanism. What is the crisis that we are facing today? Again, it's an historical crisis. I'm sure Paris Yeros has discussed this, or others, but or Bikram. We are seeing challenges at the level of the economic dimension, political and militarily, from different directions. Russia's intervention in Ukraine to stop NATO. The progressive rise of China. Al-Aqsa flood. The capacity of countries like the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, or Cuba, to sustain their economies, not just their economies, their mode of social reproduction. Remember the mode of social reproduction. Under clobbering, under sanctions, they are able to sustain a mode of social reproduction that continues to generate resistance against the Western-dominated world system. So when it does that, there is an historical process showing that more and more socio-political formations are emerging, and they are posing challenges at different levels. The system is not able to respond to this. What are we going to do? Adjustment programs are not working. Debt is not working. What can we do? The UN can be manipulated as much as we thought we could use it anymore. Of course, to a certain extent. But basically what I'm trying to say is that, and I forgot to mention, of course, the revolutionary movement in the Sahel in Africa, against French colonialism, when all these challenges cannot be contained to traditional liberal methods, so to the limitations of power, through the imposition of sanctions, what do? That's where the fascists come to the core more and more. They come to the core of the center of the political theater because there is a response now. This political configuration is creating a space. Nobody knows how to act anymore in front of all these challenges. And this is where Trump comes in the United States. But Trump is just the incarnation of a long historical process. He's filling a space that is able to incarnate much more than the forces before, because liberalism finds a limitation in that case. Nobody's able, they cannot respond to these challenges by aligning with China, of course. They have to maintain that system of world-scale accumulation and bourgeois democracy. And you cannot do that by treating the global south or by treating the workers in a fair manner. The bourgeois, as Walter Rodney rightly used to say, they're not gonna provide us the tools for their own undermining. So the alignment comes in, and this is where fascism fills the space. But this is also where we have to see the contradiction. Why? Because this is not a temporary crisis that, as we said before, can be resolved through reform or to a return to some form of liberal democracy. You remember the idea of moral progress that liberalism used to discuss about itself, this capacity of regenerating itself. They were blacks and they were slaves, and now they're not anymore. Why did it happen? Because the white were enlightened at some point. No. The rise of fascism in the core is indicating that the crisis has opened. So a space now has to be filled. Who's going to occupy that space? It can be fascist forces, but it can also be a space for something else. Because when there is a crisis, there's going to be more violence. But if there is a crisis and we are able to distinguish and identify, as Mao Zedong used to say, enemies from allies, then it means that the space for something more like socialist autonomy and struggle can emerge. And that's where we are going to, that's what we're going to do. We are filling that space fearlessly, knowing at the same time that we do not seek violence, but violence is going to come to us because this is going to be the fascist response. It's them that they're going to be violent against us. So at this point, and I think, I hope, Pavel, do I have a little bit more time?
You do. You have 10 more minutes.
Okay. So at this point, I want to arrive at the crucial question of our historical moment. So the answer to the question is, what are we witnessing in Gaza and in the broader Middle East, the Arab-Iranian region? We know what we're witnessing. The answer is unequivocal for us. We are confronting the most advanced fascist formation currently operating in the world. Zionism, or what I really like to call fascism with Jewish characteristics, because it represents not merely another manifestation of imperial violence, but it really crystallizes what we have discussed so far. Imperialism, desperate attempt to maintain dominance through systematic destruction. And the fascist ideology that sees might makes right as the only remaining principle of the international order. We are all seeing this. It's in front of our eyes. I was shocked. I missed some of his statement, but as I was preparing for this lecture, I realized that the fascist leader of the current Zionist state proclaimed, and I quote, "The weak crumble, are slaughtered, and are erased from history, while the strong survive," end quote. What is he articulating? the purest expression of fascist consciousness. Worship of strength, contempt for weakness, reduction of human existence to a Darwinian struggle where elimination of the other is natural law. This is ideological foundation for genocide. But the point is not the genocide at the same time. It's not the event itself that is happening now. We have to try also to understand more. We know what is being done. We exactly know what is being done. I already talked about this, what is happening in Gaza. The natural mode of social reproduction in Gaza is being wiped out from the face of the earth. They are trying to slaughter it all. Every 15 minutes, they are trying to kill all the children of Gaza as much as they can. So this regression to an era where might makes right, so international law collapses, the liberal international law is collapsing, the powerful impose their will through naked violence, is basically, it seems it's a breakdown of imperialism, intensifying its commitment to organized violence, because that's one of the central mechanism for maintaining control. Is going back to its foundational tenet, its foundational praxis. This very intensification creates the material condition for what, as I said before, for alternative forms also to organize and to emerge, but they are going to face violence, an immense amount of violence. So the Zionist state, the fascism of the Zionist states, operates within this imperialist crisis that we were talking about before. And for us, it is very important to understand it, because it's showing to more and more that it's not, Netanyahu's figure, because the attempt of the liberal order is, to say, look, everybody's coming out of the UN, we don't want to listen to Netanyahu. But behind Netanyahu, there are figures like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. There is the 2018 nation state law. There is the Haredim rise inside the Zionist state. Fascism is basically institutionalized openly. It's not the personification into the one man. The Zionist state is fascist. There is no democracy to save. There is only fascism to be dismantled here. So, and at the same time, I'm going to say this briefly, I'm sure all of you already know this, we can use no amount of past Jewish suffering to excuse what is happening. We know perfectly well that there is a weaponization of a certain history, a Holocaust, to shield this practice of, intensified violence and genocide. It's just it's a profound moral inversion, but it's not just a moral inversion. It's the revisionist part of the wealth of ideas that capital requires in order to maintain its primacy and supremacy. It rereads history in order to justify its own violence. It's just basic. We shouldn't approach this from a moral perspective. We should understand this in a dialectical process. They're just doing it in order to just allow themselves to continue. Now, why is it important for us to basically understand that Zionism is a very intensified incarnation of fascism? Because at this point, the war is so open that this is a front that must be fought, not because of its killing, not because it's killing so many Palestinians. No, because it's revealing the most violent face of what can come to anybody. This is fascism. And they know, when they say it's existential for them, it's existential for those who are on the side of humanity as well. Fascism can be it, but we need to, of course, be aware that this is going to be a violent struggle, because, as I said before, violence is going to come to us. Now, I also want to pose a question because I know some of you or those who are going to listen to us are going to say, why should we prioritize Palestine when Arab rulers collaborate with Zionism? There is Milei's Argentina. Some could say there is Modi's in India. There are other struggles that we are also trying. But this is not a sentiment, as I said. It's not a moral position. It's a material strategy. Zionism defeat or victory determines the condition for all other struggles at the same time. If genocide becomes normalized with impunity, that threshold recalibrates what will be done to any resisting population globally. So this is where we have to think dialectically. Every day Gaza survives, despite US-backed genocidal assault, this weakens international credibility. The Global South is observing. China is observing. Russia is fighting in Ukraine against NATO. So what we see is that creating a space, if we can fight, and this space that I was talking about before in relation to the crisis is not a space just that needs to be filled. It needs to be won in order to be filled. Because conversely, if Zionism succeeds, then all the comprador classes everywhere in the world, what they will learn? They will learn that collaboration is survival and resistance is futile. So every fascist movement, every imperial intervention is going to become emboldened. So we are not rescuing Palestinians here. They are rescuing us. They are holding the line against that violence that once normalized will target every movement. So we are not doing charity. It's a strategic self-defense for all anti-imperialist forces at this point. I want to conclude by saying to you that I found very useful the word of the Chinese president Xi Jinping in the last parade against in commemorating the war against fascism, because he told us that mankind is facing a choice, one between peace and war, dialogue or confrontation, win-win or zero-sum game. The peaceful liberal order, peaceful unquote, of course, organically lends itself to fascism. I hope I made that clear. And it structurally depends on the violence in places like Gaza, Global South, or against the workers themselves in the core. But understanding this dialectic reveals why our transition appears chaotic. Because, as I said, it contains an unprecedented amount of violence and organized destruction, but also possibility for transformation. We are living an historical moment of struggle, which has never been seen before. This is the unprecedented changes unseen in a century. The Western unipolar order is being really shaken at the core. Gaza is where the contradiction between the construction of an alternative world order, of an alternative mode of social reproduction can take place. Not just Gaza alone, but it's providing a space for us to continue fighting. Vis-a-vis what? The destruction. So again, we go back to the barbarism and socialism. And if you look at every single thinker who brought back this idea of barbarism and socialism in a very dialectic, in a very pondered manner, it was always in these moments where war had become one of the main shapes of the contradiction of the historical time. So we educate ourselves to fight and defeat fascism. And I hope these thoughts have been helpful for those who are listening today and those who will listen to me and to us in the coming days. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Matteo, comrade, thank you so much for that incredible lecture, which gives us a tremendous amount of clarity with which to sharpen our strategies and our struggles against fascism. For those who watched, I would encourage you to share this and other lectures far and wide within your movements with other comrades. It's really essential, as Matteo just laid out towards the end, that we are able to build the theoretical foundations from which to wage a struggle that can understand both the contours of the present political moment, but also importantly, the allies and enemies that we'll confront along the way. So we are now just a few minutes over time. I'll say just a couple of words about the upcoming class, which will be the final unit of this chapter on imperialism, after which we'll take a little break from the course to collect feedback, to chart next steps, and to build the next phase of the curriculum. The final unit will focus on currencies as an instrument of imperial domination and the ways in which that weaponization of currencies, especially the weaponization of the dollar, is now being challenged by new formations in the global south. So that will be at a date to be announced. I'll share the details with everyone by newsletter and on the Telegram channel, which you are all, as always, welcome to join. Matteo, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Um, and we hope we'll continue this discussion with you in the